Hello and welcome. I'm Goblin, and tonight I'm going to read you some stories from a very interesting piece of research. And the subject of research is fairies. The stories come from the Fairy Census, which is a 400-page document collected by British folklore historian Simon Young, whose prolific publication history includes not only the extensive study of fairies, but also boggarts, ghosts, hobs, mermaids, and many more fascinating topics. Many of his papers can be read on his academia page, including the Fairy Census, and all this and more will be linked in my source list, which can be found in the video's description. Concerning the Fairy Census, Young collected people's real encounters with fairies from 2014 to 2017 via a questionnaire on the website for the Fairy Investigation Society, a foundation for those who believe in, research, and/or simply have an interest in fairy lore. Originally founded in 1927, it has been reinstated several times since then, once shortly after the Second World War, when it was largely influenced by a woman named Marjorie Johnson, who, in 1955, teamed up with a Scottish folklorist named Alistair Alfin MacGregor to create their own fairy census, quote, writing letters to various newspapers and asking for reports of fairy sightings. Finally released in 2014. In 2013, the Fairy Investigation Society was reinstated again by Simon Young, after having basically dissolved in the 90s. So, in honor and inspiration of Marjorie Johnson's 1955 Fairy Census, Young collected and published his own more than 60 years later. As I said before, the information used in the Fairy Census, which is available to read either as a free PDF or as a paperback, was collected using a questionnaire on the Fairy Investigation Society website. By the way, this questionnaire is still up as more fairy censuses are being gathered. So, if you have a fairy experience you'd like to report, I encourage you to visit this page and do so. Let's take a little look at the layout of this questionnaire before we get into the stories, so you can have an understanding of how the information is collected and important factors that play into the research being done. First of all, the gender, current age, and age of the person when the experience took place is recorded. Next, the survey asks for the decade that the experience took place. For example, the 80s, the 90s, and so on, as well as the country, time of day, and time duration of the experience. Other questions ask, were you on your own or with others? What were the light conditions? And in what setting did the experience take place? Some options are on or near water, in woodland, in a garden, or on a country road. Questions are also posed to collect information about the fairies, of course, inquiring as to their sex, size, appearance, mood, and more, as well if there was any special phenomena connected to the experience, such as loss of sense of time, profound silence, goosebumps, or a sudden chill before the experience, and unusually vivid memories of the experience. Some other questions for the person submitting their experience are if they often have supernatural experiences, to which they may respond never or almost never, occasionally, or regularly, and if there was any special state connected to their experience. Some of the possible answers for this include: you were undertaking a repetitive task, such as picking blackberries. An interesting detail, since blackberries are heavily tied to fairy lore. You had just woken up or were about to fall asleep, and you were under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or medicine. There are more questions on the survey than what I just went over, but now you have an idea of what the survey entails, because it does play into the stories we are going to read. Stories were collected from all over the world, although the majority came from the UK and North America. For this video, I thought we'd start in North America, the reason being that I generally associate fairies, or my idea of fairies, with the folklore of the British Isles, and almost think of them primarily existing there. So I find it intriguing to take a look at experiences taking place in North America. The North American section of the Fairy Census starts with Canada, so that is where we will start. This first experience is from British Columbia. It says, "It was my 15th birthday, March 20th, 2006. I was walking along a hiking trail with 3 friends, 2 girls and a boy my age. It was about 5 o'clock, or a little later. The weather was gray and overcast with drizzling rain. The path we were on branches off from the main trail. We were going through a heavily wooded area, and the trail was narrow, so we went single file. We were climbing up a hill when I saw the fairy standing ahead and a bit to the right of me, between 2 younger trees. It's the only time I've ever seen a fairy that looked like a person. They were taller than me, maybe 5 feet inches to 5 foot 7 inches. They had brown skin and fair, straight hair. They were naked from the waist up and wearing dark clothing from the waist down. They were very thin looking, and I couldn't tell if they were female or male. They were very androgynous. They had a mostly human-looking face, but their eyes were a bit too big, and I couldn't see any whites in their eyes, just dark. I expected the fairy to disappear as soon as I looked directly at it, and so I waited breathlessly for a second, but it didn't. I could still see it. I asked my friends if they saw anything up ahead, and they got very quiet and said no. One friend asked if I was all right. I was afraid, but without turning around, I didn't want to look away from the fairy person thing. I told them to get back to the main trail. I was the leader of my little group of friends, and I think they understood I was serious, since the laughing, happy mood quickly evaporated, and they just obeyed me. I stayed exactly where I was, staring at the fairy, afraid to move or turn my back. When I realized my legs were shaking, I stood up really straight and stuck my chin out and tried to look brave and unconcerned. We had a stare-off for a minute or maybe a minute and a half before I said out loud, "I'm leaving now." And then I did. I turned around and walked quickly, doing my best not to run back to the main trail. My friends had just gotten back to the main trail themselves when I got there. They asked what happened, but I told them I couldn't explain it. My heart was pounding, and I felt quite sick to my stomach, like after you get a burst of adrenaline. One of my friends assumed that I had seen a ghost. They were really into that sort of thing, so I didn't deny it and didn't confirm it, and just let them think that, since the truth seemed so much more outrageous and unreal. So, there's a question in the Fairy Census that asks you to describe the fairies if they were seen. For this story, the author reiterates their description as human adult height, maybe 5'6" or 5'7", androgynous, thin, with darkish brown skin, very fair, long, straight hair, and large dark eyes with no visible whites. They were only wearing dark pants or a long skirt, and they were naked from the waist up. Another question the census asks is this: why do you think your experience was a fairy experience as opposed to a ghost, alien, angel, or some other type of anomalous experience? For this, the author wrote, "I'm not sure it was a fairy. That's just what seems to fit the best." The fairy seemed really solid and earthy and kind of animal-like, even though it looked sort of like a human. Some other details about this experience are that it seemed to last between 1 to 2 minutes, and they reported hair prickling or tingling before or during the experience, and that they have unusually vivid memories of the experience. The author also reports to have occasional supernatural experiences. Pretty incredible to see a being like this full-on and somewhat prolonged like that. I mean, 1 to 2 minutes isn't a very long time, but it's a pretty long time to see a fairy. I imagine it'd be pretty intense and maybe a little frightening as well to come head-on with something unexpected on your visit to the woods. I wonder if there was any significance to this taking place on her 15th birthday, or if that was just a coincidence. Let's read another experience from Canada. Actually, all of these are going to take place in Canada, but this one took place in Manitoba. This story took place in the 1980s when the author was a child under 10 years of age. The time was between 9 p.m. and 12 a.m. I awoke in my bed to find myself surrounded by tiny men dressed in brown holding spears. They did not speak, but I was aware that if I moved or cried out, they would stab me. I could not move and did not cry out. When they finally left, I felt that I had passed some test and that I would not be taken. It is a very strong memory. I believed that my home in the country was surrounded by good fairies who lived in the trees, but these were malevolent. and I thought they must be brownies. That's a pretty distressing experience for a child. We must remember that not all fairies are innocent, benevolent, winged creatures as depicted in Disney movies. And while the author does believe that good fairies inhabited the area surrounding her home, these, obviously, were not of that nature. She identifies them as brownies, which are typically a categorization of fairies who are small humanoid beings who assist with household chores and are generally harmless unless you anger, insult, or neglect them. In that case, they can become quite fearsome, possibly even turning into boggarts, which can be a catch-all term for dangerous or frightening spirits who exhibit a variety of forms. Simon Young, the curator of the Fairy Census, actually has an expertise on boggarts and their varieties, which you can read about in his books and essays. Their description of the brownies, tiny men in brown holding spears, specifically matches the description of the brownies depicted in the 1988 fantasy adventure film Willow, a childhood favorite of mine. An exact year isn't given for this experience, just that it took place in the 80s, so it's possible that they had seen the film and gotten the idea that these beings were brownies from that, because I've never known brownies to tout spears in any depiction outside of that film. Generally, it's brooms they're wielding. Additional information is that the experience seemed to last between 2 and 10 minutes, and that the author has occasional supernatural experiences. They also reported hair tingling or prickling, a sense that the experience was put on display specially for them, and that the event marked a turning point in their life. Of course, they also noted that this took place after they had just woken. Remember that one of the special states that one may report tied to their experience is that you had just woken up or were about to go to sleep. So why are these states included on the Fairy Census? What relevance do they have to the experience of seeing fairies, and are they important? According to Simon Young, these special states are related to trance states, a sort of altered consciousness. And while that sounds very mystical, trance states are actually a frequent part of our daily lives. Here's a quote from a recent paper of his called In Search of Past Lives. A frequently experienced version of trance is the driver who cannot remember part of the journey between home and work because they have gone into autopilot. Repetitive, automatic actions seem particularly effective in inducing trance states. Rhythmical dancing, drumming, singing, picking berries, factory work, meditative breathing, even aimlessly flicking between TV channels. Trance states are often also associated with exhaustion or sleep. We more easily enter trances while we are getting ready for bed, when we wake unexpectedly in the night, or while we are struggling up in the morning. These states can be useful because our conscious mind is partially or totally suspended. Information can emerge from our unconscious, much as happens in dreams. He goes on to say that, quote, an unusual number of supernatural experiences take place during repetitive actions or while entering or leaving sleep. Ghosts, fairies, and aliens are far more likely to appear to people driving at night than to someone talking to a friend at midday in Starbucks, end quote. The idea of these trance states and their relation to supernatural experiences is extremely interesting, and I do think this information is very important and meaningful to the research Simon is doing. As he said, unconscious information is more easily accessible in trance states. It's kind of like you are a radio dial hovering between two stations, and when you don't have one clear, focused broadcast blaring in your ear, flooding your senses, you have the ability to pick up some fringe feedback that comes from the soft static. The next story took place in Nova Scotia when the author was in her 20s, between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. We were watching the stars on December 21st of 2012, just past midnight, when we both saw a woman step out of the woods. The area where we were was basically a large aspen tree of 9 trees grown together, surrounded by woods. The woman had a long silver, purple, and green gown and long hair with 7 stars in it. She seemed to be made of light, with what might have been a crown on her head. She walked from the woods and paused at the tree, looking right at us before walking into the tree. Then, it was as though the shadows began to close in, and something larger descended from the tree, like a big spider. Needless to say, we did not stick around. We left in a hurry. After that, my friend who also saw it had a terrible spree of bad luck, which ended when he later returned to the place with a gift and an apology. Personally, I think this is a particularly magical setting for a fairy encounter. Late at night, some might say the witching hours, at the edge of a wood, watching the stars. The author reported having unusually vivid memories of this experience, which you can tell from the description of the woman's gown, down to the colors and the number of stars in her hair. Since this woman from the wood bore a crown on her head, may we assume that she is a fairy queen? If so, she would be a very powerful being to encounter, indeed. Perhaps they spied her entering back into the realm of fairy through the great aspen tree, and perhaps she was none too glad. Interestingly enough, aspen trees are actually known in folklore to be entrances to fairy and the underworld. There's a belief in Greek and Celtic mythology that to wear a crown of aspen leaves gives one the ability to pass easily between worlds. It has also been said that aspen trees have the magical ability to protect buried treasure. So, could it be that this fairy woman was protecting either some sort of precious treasure or an entrance to another realm? What I like about this story is that it turns from beautiful to horrifying. When, after the woman walks into the tree, the place darkens and they see what seems to be a large spider descend from its branches. It would have to be enormous for them to see it in the dark from so far away, right? That's what nightmares are made of. And I couldn't help but be reminded of a ghost story by author M.R. James called The Ash Tree, where a colony of huge venomous spiders live within a big tree, controlled by a sinister witch woman. The author noted that the experience lasted 2 to 10 minutes, although they did indicate a loss of sense of time, and felt a sudden chill before the experience, and hair tingling or prickling during it. They put down that the mood of the fairy was mischievous and aloof, but it does seem that they smoothed it over in the end with a gift. Fairies are said to love gifts of milk, cream, bread, honey, and alcohol. Now, let's read another story. This next experience took place in Ontario, sometime between 2000 and 2010. Me and my best friend at age 8 were in the countryside for a family barbecue in the fall. We decided to go play in the large woods that evening, just as the sun was starting to set behind the house, because all of the other kids were doing it. We had wandered maybe 3 minutes into the woods. We could still hear the party faintly when we came across a ring of mushrooms. I had heard of these being somehow connected to fairies, so me and my friend danced around the inside of it for a couple of minutes. When nothing seemed to happen, we left the circle to continue playing. But when we stepped out of the circle, the warm sunset lighting suddenly faded to the point where it was almost pitch black, and we heard our names being called out. We ran towards the voice and found most of the family looking for us. We had apparently been gone for hours. They couldn't see or hear us, even though we were a few minutes from the party in a relatively undense part of the forest, and their hunting dog couldn't smell us. Although the author was familiar with the association of toadstool rings and fairies, it seems they didn't know the consequences of stepping foot in one. A circle formed in the grass by mushrooms is, of course, called a fairy ring, and fairies are said to dance within them. Sure, sounds whimsical and fun, but it's actually quite dangerous. Fairies have been said to lure humans to come dance with them, and then enchant them so the person can't stop dancing until they eventually die of exhaustion. Additionally, joining them, or simply setting foot inside the ring, can have you pulled into the phase realm, where time passes much more quickly, and what feels like just a few short hours actually amounts to years in the human world. And this sort of time loss did seem to have occurred in the story, as for them, the experience of dancing in the mushroom ring only lasted 2 to 10 minutes, but hours had apparently passed at the barbecue they were attending. They also reported a sudden warmth and profound silence before the experience. This silence is known as the Oz factor, and is common in events of high strangeness and paranormal experiences. Interestingly, they indicated that they have both unusually vivid memories and unusually clouded memories of the experience. That seems to contradict itself, but perhaps they mean that some of the details are extremely vivid while others are muddled. And I think that makes sense, especially given the loss of time. It seems they might have indicated that they heard some sounds. There's a text box on the fairy survey that asks, if you heard fairy music or sounds, how would you describe these? And the author submitted, since it happened a while ago, I can't remember the exact noises, but I do think I remember giggles that weren't mine or my friends, and bells or wind chimes. Bells or chimes have a particular association with the presence of fairies. My ears always perk up when I hear bells, especially church bells, and I always pause for a moment to take in the magical quality of those sounds, and take note of any magic about. Finally, they said that they never, or almost never, have supernatural experiences, and I always find that to be extremely interesting. Not that I think it makes the story any more or less credible. I suppose I just think that people who have had more supernatural experiences are a little more likely to share their experience because they might have gained some confidence through repeated experience, whereas someone who has only had one isolated incident of paranormality might be more questioning of their encounter or self-conscious about sharing their story. But I'm really, really glad that they felt comfortable submitting it. I'm sure being anonymous helps. Our next encounter from Ontario took place between 2000 and 2010, when the author was in her 30s. The time was between noon and 3 p.m. She stated she was angry and cooling off from an argument with her husband. I was sitting watching the water, the edge of a bank of a local creek. Suddenly, what I assumed was a dragonfly came around the right side of my head and paused, hovering directly in front of my eyes for approximately 5 to 10 seconds, just long enough to see exactly what I was looking at, and it wasn't a dragonfly. It was the exact shape, size, and proportions as a dragonfly, with the very same wings, but it was a tiny woman with pale skin, long brown hair, wearing an ivory silk shift. Perhaps 12 inches from my face, she hovered, looking back at me as intently as I looked at her. Then she flew off again, in the very same manner as a dragonfly. If she hadn't come as close as she did, and paused so long, I'd have mistaken her for just that. I sat there a moment longer in astonishment, then jumped up to run and tell my family what I'd just seen, and, of course, sadly, no one could possibly believe me. Simon Young also has a podcast where he and his co-host, Chris Woodyard, discuss different topics of fairy, ghost, and folklore. In one episode, they mentioned how it's common for people to see a dragonfly and mistake it at first glance for a fairy. Upon further investigation, it registers, of course, that the creature is a dragonfly. It's interesting then, when the opposite of this instance occurs, when someone sees a creature they believe is a dragonfly, and then come to find that it is a fairy. There is another experience from Ontario where fairies with dragonfly wings are seen. This one took place in the 1950s, and it was between 12 and 3 p.m. My sister and I were digging in our backyard. Suddenly, a group of fairies flew out of the hole. They were all dressed up like we had interrupted a formal ball. The males were in tuxedos and the females were in colorful evening gowns with jewelry and long gloves. My sister was 4 or 5 and I was a year older. We were startled and ran into the house, where we watched them from the back porch. The author said that the fairies looked like tiny people with wings like dragonflies. They were dressed in formal clothes. So they don't go into too many details about the fairies, other than that they had dragonfly wings and formal clothes. Fairies are pretty much never seen wearing modern clothing. If they are wearing clothing at all, they are almost always from a bygone era. Simon Young says usually from the previous century, at least. Given that the author of this story mentions tuxedos and long gloves, tells me that we can place these fairy fashions somewhere between the mid-19th and early 20th century. Sure, tuxedos are still a part of modern fashion, but long gloves and evening gowns, not so much. So there you have it. Those are just a few experiences from the Fairy Census, and there are hundreds more. I definitely plan on reading more of them for you. But if you'd like to dig in yourself or submit your own experience, as long as it's real, no fairy tales please, this is for collecting legitimate data, then I encourage you to do so. And once again, links will be in my source list in the video's description. And if you find yourself thinking that all of that sounds ridiculous because you don't believe in fairies, well, that doesn't really matter, because that's not the point of collecting this information. Of the Fairy Census, Simon Young says, quote, "There is no attempt here to undertake the hopeless task of proving the existence or non-existence of fairies. The census focused on witnesses rather than fairies. What kind of people see fairies, and under what conditions?" So, the Fairy Census intention is to examine the modern attitudes regarding fairies, not to prove they're real. I personally really enjoy combing through these experiences and reading them, and now sharing them with you. If you're familiar at all with my channel, then you'll know that I obviously love stories of first-hand supernatural experiences. So, while I do find it to be entertaining, I also think it's important. This type of research is typically shirked or dismissed by experts in varying fields of science and academia. Experiential data is often neglected and deemed controversial, unreliable, or just isn't taken seriously. And yet, so many people have these experiences, countless individuals. The Fairy Census legitimizes these people's experience through their publication, and not only facilitates fascinating research, but also serves as a platform for individuals to share their encounters confidently and without judgment. A big thank you to Simon Young, someone I really admire, for permission to use these stories from the Fairy Census. Please go check out his academia page and his books and his podcast, because it's all really wonderful stuff. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and until next time.